This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Permanish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hey everyone, just the briefest of intros for today's Soulfire Fireside Chat, a format where we delve into philosophical approaches that help guide us into how we work with and within different life worlds. Today I'm speaking with David McConville, a media artist, immersive designer, and thought leader who's dedicated to expanding our understanding of planetary systems, cosmologies, and worldviews. He's designed large-scale installations that reveal complex data about Earth systems, working with institutions like NASA, UNESCO, and planetariums worldwide. He is also the co-founder of Spherical Studio, which you'll be hearing about in this episode. And this conversation brings us into the complex topic of how do we make worldviews visible, toggling from macro views to details that can actually support communities with very real decisions on the ground, bridging scales from the cosmic to the planetary to the bioregional. We get quite technical, using the case of Los Angeles infrastructure, and actually how infrastructure itself is a belief system. And we learn about the work that David's studio is doing inside of the LA watershed with their local communities in developing mapping tools and local processes, all within a notion of living infrastructure. Now, even if you aren't local to LA, but I have to say if you are, or proximate to, this episode is definitely one that will have your ears perk up. There's so much here in terms of approaches that can be applied to how communities organize, make sense of data, and build their worlds with a holistic worldview. Over to my conversation with David. David, my dear, hello. Welcome to this Life World Soulfire Fireside Chat.
Good to see you, Alexa.
Good to see you. David, you are an artist and a creator and a thinker and a doer, and you've birthed such a multifaceted and rich body of work. You've co-founded Spherical Studio with your partner Dawn, which is, in your own words, a research and design strategy studio, incubating many projects, one of which is your groundbreaking work in the LA watershed, which we're going to hone in on today. And also before that, some of your work was tied to these incredible large-scale installations and visualizations of Gaian systems. And in your own language, these nested scales of existence that help to illuminate the worldviews we live within. And you and I were just chatting before we came on, quote unquote, live, and sort of about this critical juncture that we're in, right? A very particular time that we're chatting for a fireside chat. I mean, we're speaking post LA wildfires, and these are communities you've been working with very closely and have some fascinating tools that you'll be sharing, I think, in our conversation. The living infrastructure framework and some of the field kits, and how we can transform quote unquote crisis into action. But just to kick us off, I remember when I moved to San Francisco, like in 2019, and my friends were like, you have to look at this guy David's work, and it's so inspiring, and he talks about worldviews, and I watched a ton of your videos. And just for some of our listeners, you know, in a way we hear these terms thrown around, but because we're going to be talking about frameworks that humans operate in, and then how those frameworks actually influence the work we do on the ground, like very practically. These worldviews, what are they? Are they philosophical? Are they practical? What do you think about and convey to people when you speak about things like worldviews?
That's a big question. I think that thank you for the provocation. I hold the term worldview very lightly because it's so seemingly all-encompassing it was actually introduced by Immanuel Kant as a Weltanschauung. That the idea that it's like this all-encompassing view of everything, and they're tricky to pin down, but they're useful as a heuristic, as like a shortcut for thinking about just one's perspective on life. But what I've come to appreciate is the degree to which they're not an individual thing, that they are enacted and embodied and entrained in the context of our cultural context, in the context of our life's practices, in the context of, all of the daily routines and rituals that we go through. And so, whereas like philosophically, I think the temptation is to try to think about it as something that you hold inside of your head as the filter through which you're perceiving everything. I think that's, rather reductionist with regards to recognizing that we are in these streams of culture that shape, how it is that not only we perceive and cognize the world, but how we're acting within it. And a lot of times, at least in the past few years, I've come to think of them more like rivers, and it's helpful to understand the headwaters that our understandings and perspectives and paradigms came from, and why those currents are so strong, and to see where they're leading. Because there's so much that often goes unacknowledged in the context of what we believe. And that's it. I find to be more enlivening to engage in a conversation about which rivers we're swimming in, like what water are we in that we're not even seeing or perceiving, because they're having such a profound effect on everything we do.
Why were you drawn to this in the first place, actually? Even like the spherical visualizations that you did. And there's so many things you could have turned your mind to, and why this initially?
I was raised in the American South, in a very fundamentalist context, fundamentalist Christian context, and even at a young age, I was pretty confused by a lot of the assertions about the nature of reality by my family, and so by the time I was a teenager, I was in sort of full revolt mode, just questioning everything. Because when I was a kid, there's only so much you can do when you're a kid in terms of questioning things and trying to make sense of things. You don't have access to a lot of other diverse perspectives. And, I really credit what I like to think of as negative example for my own development, that I saw a lot of things that just really intuitively felt nonsensical and extremely limiting. Not everyone in my family, but like definitely some of the key elements growing up. I really was curious about how those came to be, and it was somewhat. It wasn't even so much personalizing them as individuals, but wondering about what, like I said, what I've come to see as sort of the water that they were swimming in, and trying to make sense of that. So, pretty quickly got interested in the nature of how our understanding of the world is shaped, how our experiences shape the ways in which we make sense of everything, which drew me pretty deeply into a study of perception and cognition, and how it is that direct experience shapes understanding. Because so much of the proverbial river that any of us are in, it's shaped by the direct experiences that we have, whether when I was, baptized into the Southern Baptist Church, or whether it's, the rituals, coming of age rituals that are in many different cultures. Like, these are constantly, enacting particular patterns within a culture. And so I became extremely interested in how those practices and processes and rituals were embodying particular rivers in what they were doing, with and for and to people inside of their broader context, which, led kind of a circuitous path to thinking a lot about immersion, and perception, and the consequences of what it means to try to make sense of the world and the cosmos, and the consequences of attempting to map that. So much of my work in previous years was looking at cosmography, the attempt to kind of map everything and what that means in the context of various worldviews and belief systems, up to and including contemporary scientific attempts to map and measure the cosmos, and looking at those maps in a way to reveal what the processes were that led to the presumption that they could be mapped, right? And that's where a lot of my work with spheres sort of started to converge around looking at the idea of the heavens and why so many different cultures, hold domes to be sort of sacred spaces, and how it is they render their understandings of the sphere, of the celestial sphere, and that really for me helped to solidify both, an understanding of the combination of kind of our own personal experience. So obviously our visual field is spherical. It makes a lot of sense physiologically why the sphere is a profound metaphor for experience, pretty universally across humanity, which is one of those weird things because, universalism's usually frowned upon, and at least in academia. But as a pattern, I found it really fascinating, because then you see mosques and stupas and cathedrals and all of these different traditions that are embodying the heavens in a sphere. And for me, it was just sort of an elegant metaphorical way to enter into this conversation about worldviews that was a lot more grounded and embodied, and relatable. That, when I started to play with it, it really yielded, I think, some interesting opportunities to poke and prod at how it is the mapping of worlds and cosmos and the representation of these things enable us to, in a way, look back at it in a sort of a metacognitive way to say, like, oh, well, we mapped it this way. Why did we map it this way? Everything from like cave paintings and attempting to make sense of constellations in the sky, to the acts of scientific observations and using telescopes and satellites to take pictures of, galaxies, hundreds of millions of light years away. And what does that say about how we're assuming that we have the capability of doing that, and how we're making sense of that?
It's so fascinating, right? Because the way that we map the world affects how we think about it, but then the way we're even thinking is like the lens through which we do the mapping. So it's like a really interesting recursive thing. And obviously, well, you were front and center of this with your work with the Bucky Fuller Institute. But if you think about like system science, right, in this world, like looking back at itself through all of the different interconnections, and I've seen some of this with my work recently in ecology with the Crowther Lab, but it's like, we looked into space and we have this overview effect, and we're like, oh my God, with this rock floating in space, that was huge for, humanity, as I think many people know. And then these satellites in the sky helped us to see down below. And when we did that, I think we've shared some visualizations and presentations that we've both done, which is like the Earth as this breathing, alive, completely interconnected being, if you will, right? Which was sort of Gaia theory, if you will. And what I think is fascinating is that then on that understanding is now leading, okay, so from the visualization, how do we then bring the most useful versions of that to people so they can make actual decisions? And I think that's been what's so captivating following you and Dawn's journey and your team the last few years, is like from this massive micro, perspective of like satellites and AI and our worldviews and who are we as this, Gaian organism in space. That then leads to like decisions around, well, when we land this to a community, what's actually useful? And I'm sure that actually a lot of the like big picture visualization stuff is not as necessary or helpful. And so I'm so curious in your own process, like how do you toggle from this big macro view where everything is connected and the Amazon is affecting the rainfall in LA to like, what are the details that people really need to know and want to work with on the ground to make decisions that, affect them? Like that kind of toggling must be quite tricky.
Yeah, quite. These questions have been front and center for me for many years. There helped to run a project for about 4 years called the Worldviews Network, that was creating productions in science centers, mostly in planetariums across the United States, with a number of scientists and educators and artists that were looking at these planetary dynamics. Right, we were trying to bridge the scales from the cosmic to the planetary to the bioregional in a narrative structure, using visualizations inside of these immersive spaces in real time as kind of storytelling environments, so that we could focus on some particular aspect of the place that we were in. Like, for instance, we did a show in Texas, and we've really focused on water because towns at the time, still are, were running out of water. And having a sense of the global water cycle and what other places had done to rehydrate their landscapes was really critical, because I think the nature of talking about planetarity, that's usually oftentimes in the popular discourse reduced to just climate, which then gets reduced to just CO2, which is, of course, a critical thing. But there are so many other ways into understanding the nature of living systems, right? Like, we don't think about just one aspect of our own body as contributing to health, right? That there's a huge, complex, set of relations that enables health. And so we were trying to understand and relate the nature of Earth in relationship to the sun and the galaxy and the history of cosmic evolution, to the dynamics of what's going on with El Nino and La Nina and the biotic pumps and the rainforest and the various water cycles and the atmospheric rivers, and all of these things that happen at a planetary scale, down to the ground of these bioregions, asking the questions of, like, okay, what are the implications here? For instance, we did a production at the California Academy of Sciences that was all about looking at the migration of trees in different climate scenarios, particularly the Valley Oaks, and the role that cultural burning had played traditionally. Invited in a number of tribes in California to come and speak to that. And, and this was 14 years ago. It was a while ago. And at the time, a lot of these topics weren't necessarily sort of at the forefront of popular discourse. Now they're kind of all over the place because of the urgency of what's happening. And what I found was that I was woefully unprepared for engaging in communities in a way that any of this was more than just informational. And it was
why were you unprepared?
It was a bit devastating, because I realized that we could go in and spend all this effort to create these productions and share this knowledge and, kind of relate all this, like, extraordinary understanding of contemporary science. And ultimately folks could have an epiphany, but it would fade. Right. And before it would fade, they would actually feel a bit of a hangover. I called it the post-epiphanic hangover at the time, because it was like you get the dynamics of everything from seeing the paradoxes of us trying to observe and map the cosmic microwave background, all the way into your own backyard, of how it is we're observing and mapping and selecting what we map about particular dynamics happening in bioregions. And, it's a very rich conversation, and you can see certain patterns occurring within the context of these data layers and these visualizations, and and inducing insights that I think are extraordinarily important. But in order for those to be sustained and metabolized as something that's actionable, as something that can actually transform how we relate to our surroundings, to our communities both human and non-human, that takes process and time and developmental capacities that I had not really considered at the time. That I was convinced that, I think tacitly, I don't think I said this explicitly, but we would go in and we would share this stuff, and people would have epiphanies, and they would see that these things need to be done, and they would have the will to go do that. And that was really hubristic, honestly. That there's a value in that as a step in a process, I think. but there are reasons that cultures that have sustained the dynamics of relationality over generations and over millennia, they have very sustained practices and very sustained rituals and very sustained stories that enable the enactment of those relations over time. And it's not just a run and gun kind of thing. And and I think that belief that I had was very much, sort of part and parcel of the culture that I've been raised in, right? That it was all about information sharing that mattered.
If people have the information, they'll change. But it's what you said before. I mean, everything is practiced. So how, from that kind of moment where you're like, oh shoot, I am not equipped to actually how do I support people with this information? What journey did you then go on to start thinking about those processes, those enactments, those rituals? Like, what did you do when you sort of realized, okay, I need to do additional steps here?
Yeah. I kind of radically shifted my life because I'd taken the experiment to what felt like a logical extreme, to a conclusion. And it required that I go on a bit of a walkabout, to borrow a term from Aboriginal communities, and explore who was possibly asking these deeper questions. And I was fortunate enough to encounter some communities working in the realm of regenerative development that I felt were really beginning to, at least for me, beginning to make sense in terms of the groundedness that's necessary beyond just epiphanies and information sharing.
And
And
those groups, those kind of
specifically, it was
people.
Regenesis group out of New Mexico, right? And because they were essentially like folks looking at organizations and places as living systems. And had formalized various frameworks and approaches that they had been developing, and others had been developing, and if arguably it had traced lineages back, millennia, in terms of understanding the nature of how humans develop, and that and I joke about it as like, you can't tell anybody anything. That folks have to come to their own realizations. What's most important is to set the conditions so that people can self-inquire and understand their own experience. And for me, this was a profound insight and a profound assertion, because from a very young age, I recognized, that it was our own direct experience that shapes our personal and collective evolution. And the ways in which those experiences are shaped and designed, consciously or not, have everything to do with how our worldviews are enacted. And so I engaged in a pretty deep study for the past 10 years with a lot of these folks to really understand what can be done from the perspective of understanding the patterns and processes and structures of living systems, how they work, including the dynamics of the living systems in the social realm, human organizational dynamics. It's not just kind of the functional aspects of so much of what I know you cover in this podcast. That looking at forests and landscapes and oceans and all the things, absolutely critical. But what I kept encountering was the complex dynamics of human living systems, and how that is interpreted through the lenses of different cultures, and the absolute importance and significance of recognizing the paradigms underlying the ways in which sense is being made of those systems and how those systems are designed, and being able to acknowledge the mindsets and the worldviews from which those systems have emerged, right? So the nature...
Yeah. I was just going to say on that point, bring us into maybe a community you've worked with that feels sort of front of mind in life for you, where, you co-designed this living systems process where maybe worldviews and assumptions were made explicit, and then the visualization was actually designed in such a way that it was useful for people. I would love for you to land how that is now like a very different process to what came before.
Yeah. Well, before jumping straight into examples, I think like looking at the field that I landed on in recent years is the field of infrastructure, because in many ways, like it is the enactment of the worldview, right? In the same way that, like, you know, strangely, like if you look at religious environments, you know, that's the infrastructure of spirituality in a lot of ways, right? Like people go to churches, they have their like sacred burial spaces. There's like, that's an infrastructure for sustaining particular belief systems and making sense of the world and the cosmos, right? Well, the way that most of us think about infrastructure, it's like roads and it's water, you know, and it's the built environment, right? And that is actually an embodiment very much the same way of how spiritual environments are embodiments of those beliefs. So what does infrastructure tell us about the nature of, you know, the belief systems that from which they emerged, right? And when I consider that and this really started back with the Worldviews Network, because I was, you know, we did a show at the Hayden Planetarium and the American Museum of Natural History in New York that was all about the infrastructure of high-rise buildings and glass that were that were killing birds, right? And so, like, what does that tell us about the people that built those high-rise buildings, having like no consideration whatsoever of the flows, like the metabolism of migrations, right? And so, in many ways, like this examination of infrastructure emerged from me wanting to look at sort of maps of the world and how, you know, they embody what gets enacted. Mm-hmm. And so now the work that we are really focused on is infrastructure in California, and more specifically Los Angeles. And a lot of the lessons that I learned in working on planetary visualizations and metabolism, and, you know, going deep into the history of Gaia theory, now, you know, more formally known as Earth system science, and the nature of the self-regulating, you know, biospheric interactions of, you know, that are sustaining life on the planet, that seem to be a pretty significant blind spot for almost everybody working in technology these days. You know, that looking at that at a planetary scale, I found to be extremely important. We are still doing an entire project called Gaian Systems to understand the dynamics of seeing the planet, you know, mechanically as just a homeostatic, you know, system that's self-regulating versus one that is biotic in nature, that, you know, is, as Lynn Margulis pointed out, is constantly self-regulating through life itself. And taking the lessons learned from that exploration, examining how it is that we, and I use we very loosely, but kind of how infrastructure has been designed within modernity, and what affordances that has for the living systems that are necessary to sustain life on the planet, right? That the very nature in LA is probably like the quintessential case of, you know, the most obvious embodiment of worldviews and infrastructure one can imagine, right? Because for those of you that don't, you know the history of this, you know, movies have been made about this, Chinatown being the most famous, but the idea that you could just put in pipes, suck water from somewhere else, you know, fill this place with water and bring it to life indefinitely forever, is basically the premise of a lot of the infrastructure there. And a lot of, when we were invited in to begin working on ways of transforming Los Angeles's infrastructure, we spent many years looking at sort of this history and this context and the complexities of all of this, and getting to understand the historical ecologies and the cultures that were there. and the three phases of colonization, the indigenous cultures, and then the phases of colonization that occurred, and sort of the implications of all of that on how infrastructure was built out to get to the point where we are now, right? And that was absolutely essential context for, I know this is a long way to get around to responding to your original question, but
it's important background.
I mean, yeah, because I think one of the biggest dangers is decontextualizing any of this, right? To just like jump in with the answer and this is the cause. I mean, because there's a lot of contributing complex causal factors to what's going on right now. And I think the temptation is to look for the one thing and to solve for the one thing. And that continuously fails, because when you just solve for that one thing, there are cascading effects of ignoring all the others. And it often exacerbates the very thing that you set out to solve. So we're dealing with this extraordinarily paradoxical, pattern wherein people with very good intentions, are going in and trying to solve something, and they end up actually making it worse, right? And so this notion of multi-solving, Beth Sawin has introduced this concept of like, okay, how do you look at the whole system? And and Fuller was all about this. Buckminster Fuller was all about this. So there's deep histories of trying to think about whole systems and how to engage all of this concurrently. But in the context of the work in LA, it is giving us very pragmatic grounds to engage in this complexity, that it's very, very non-theoretical. And what we are currently doing as a studio is developing a field, basically a field kit, which is both software, community mapping tools, educational tools, and entire programs around engagement to be working with communities on the ground so that we can understand the nature of the challenges there and be able to co-design the infrastructure in a way that is like truly taking into account the potential of the place. Not just the place as like a tabula rasa, a blank slate, but like that's deeply situated with historical patterns, with historical context, with historical injustices, with indigenous cultures, like that. These are all aspects of the place that need to be considered in order to consider what can and should be happening there to address the increasing extremes of the both the local and the global climate, right? And in order to do that, we've had to develop these tools that are really focused on not just sort of telling people like, okay, here's all these things that can happen. And, and there's a lot of conversation going on right now after the LA fires in particular about the importance of water, and on whether it's like, certain politicians saying, turn on the tap, which is not a thing. Or it's, advocates advocating for the rehydration of the landscapes and the restoration of the small water cycles, which is actually extremely important. And from a practical perspective, LA has many, many, many people that have been working on this for many years. And the manifestations of that work have resulted in bond measures, particularly one that's a tax on impervious surfaces, which is taxed because when you lay down pavement, concrete, which LA is infamous for, it stops water from absorbing into the soil. It stops water from getting into, the giant caverns underneath that create groundwater, right? That wells depend on in order to draw water up to the surface. And in doing that, it dehydrates the landscape, it desiccates the landscape. And a lot of the historical ecologies and the wetlands and the ecosystems are no longer able to function. And humans come in and build stuff on top of these impervious surfaces, and it gets really, really hot. And the ecosystems have been totally destabilized. And then, the Santa Ana winds come in and fires happen. And a lot of the native vegetation that is fire adapted, has been torn away, and there are other invasive species, or introduced species. I don't like calling them invasive necessarily, but introduced species that aren't fire adapted, that are more likely to burn. And then there are a bunch of development decisions that are made, to kind of exacerbate the dangers for the built environment. And, the water that's being pumped in from elsewhere is being done so inside of an infrastructural system that was never designed for the scale of fires that LA is seeing now. No city is. There is no urban environment that could handle this kind of devastation. And so all of these factors contribute to kind of, the perfect storm of danger for people in the community. And a lot of what we focused on is how the bond measures that have emerged from the work of these groups working on watershed health, working to help communities depave and cool their schoolyards and cool their communities and work at the level of their microclimates, has resulted in significant money that's available for communities to do that. And from a practical perspective, what we found was that it was really complicated for communities to come together and do that, as you might imagine, right? Like if somebody came to you, they were like, okay, we want to, work on your neighborhood and rehydrate it in this very complex urban environment. We want to provide shade and cooling and all of these things and, clean your water, okay, give us a proposal. What would you do? Where would you start? Right? Especially if you can't afford to hire consultants or landscape architects and engineering firms. And, it's extremely complex to even imagine what's possible because there's so much context that needs to be taken into account. And so we began developing community mapping tools that were really designed to help create processes or support processes, I should say, because a lot of these processes were already going on. I mean, that's, I want to emphasize, nothing that we're doing is that, unique in the sense that the communities have really led the efforts on this. And I've personally been just absolutely, inspired and amazed at the consistency and the devotion of many of these people to their communities, to their places, and decades and decades and decades of work that we're just kind of coming in the past number of years, trying to understand how to support that, and also working extremely closely with them and brought in by a group of folks that have actually been working on this for decades. So we were fortunate enough to automatically be within a context that allows us the extreme gift of being able to have relationships in place and to be able to work with people and co-design these tools. And so from a practical...
a quick question on that part. Mm-hmm. When you brought in the mapping tools, as you said, people have been working there for decades. It was their place. What was something that was surprising to you guys or to them when you started visualizing the systems in this way? Like whether you were taking, the perspective of the cement or the tree or the water systems, or what arose that wasn't necessarily obvious before?
A lot of it had to do with, obvious to who and when. Right? That as we started to work with more groups and communities, there were certain things that were very obvious to some communities and were completely unknown to others, right? And vice versa, right? And so as we began to explore the various things that we could visualize, like things that were totally obvious to the water engineers in the county, other folks had never even considered the ability to see GIS data of flows of water coming down the topography of the mountains and into the storm drain systems so that you could understand actually where the water is coming from and where it's going once it's through your property, right? And so that is an example of something that data was out there, but it wasn't being designed in such a way that it was accessible to, the general audiences, right? They were locked away in kind of obscure government servers, and sure, it was open, but it wasn't necessarily being formatted in a way that was readily accessible to folks that might be interested, and sometimes pretty difficult to find. because that's
Did you see
actually
anything
not.
that surprised you? Did you see anything that surprised you as either in how people were using the information or coming across it, or just in your own knowledge?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, a number of things. I mean, in inquiring into how to visualize the water systems, for instance, we found a remarkable series of data sets from a landscape architect named Barry Lehrman, who'd been studying the aqueducts of California for, over a decade, much longer, I think. And we were able to visualize the watersheds that were being drawn from in order to feed LA. And he calls them aqueduct sheds, right? So the aqueducts are basically the pipelines that are coming from the Colorado River Basin, from Payahanadu, the Owens Valley, from the Bay Area, to get a sense of like the implications of what it means to be this infrastructure, to be drawing this water into, one place. We also, found a project called LA Landscape History that were academics that were inspired by the Manhattan Project in New York, if you're familiar with that, that's looking at historical ecology. But they looked at the historical ecology of Los Angeles. And so we were able to turn that into kind of a map of little sprites. So when you look at it in an oblique view, you can actually get an impression of the historical ecology of the LA basin, which was not a desert, historically. And that's one of the big stories that people tell themselves, like, LA is a desert and we brought life to it by bringing water here. It's like, no, actually there were like amazing riparian zones and wetlands and chaparral and all these different types of ecosystems. That's very, very helpful to understand what the nature of that place was and the purpose of that place in many ways, by being at the, at the basin from these huge drop-offs and, and water that was coming down there in the sedimentary layers, and why it was so rich with, oil and gas deposits, and sort of the geological history of the place comes into play when you start looking at like how a lot of these data layers are revealing particular aspects of the place. And so there were so many elements of the uniqueness of the LA basin that really struck me. And also, it struck me how many of them were in sort of disparate places, right? That there were different disciplines or agencies or, academic initiatives studying different parts of it. And so we've attempted to curate a lot of this quantitative data into a place that we can explore different relationships and narratives and stories when considering the context of the infrastructure design.
That's so fascinating. Wow. And I also was under the very foolish understanding that LA was much more of a desertified environment. And so a few years on, you've now, well, you spoke about processes, right? And so you've mentioned the tools that you developed and built. And what was the sort of human praxis or processes around these tools that you then developed or co-developed with them? I'm super curious about that piece.
Sure. I mean, it was obviously the most important part, that we were able to work with, I think around 50 community-based organizations. Our folks on the ground in LA have a really remarkable engagement team that have, from the communities there, that have, engaged in a pretty extensive process of listening and trying to understand where the places are that support is needed in order to even get technical assistance for applying some of the infrastructure grants. And the process was really, it was complex because in developing software, there is a particular paradigm that comes from the Bay Area of how software is developed. And it's usually driven by the desire to create things quickly and to get a quick return and to kind of prove the value, to jack the valuation, and to sell to return, profits to the investors, right? So everything flows from there, right? So like when you talk about, yeah, I mean, exactly. But when you talk about, worldviews underlying the way things are enacted, that's how most software gets created. And there's a usually a veneer of like being good, not so much anymore, but they're like, for a while there, they were like, oh no, but it's for the good. This is helping people. This is doing that, masks off at this point around all of that, right? Nobody's really pretending that to be the case anymore. But that is the mentality of many of the software processes. And we, as a studio, have been immensely challenged to transform a lot of those assumptions. That we have been, many of the folks on our crew have been trained in those formal processes. So, have been trained in all kinds of product management and UX design and engineering processes. And of course, we use all of those things because that's what's necessary in order to create these tools. And, with those often comes structures and techniques that are very, very indicative of the paradigms out of which they emerged, namely like hierarchy, command and control, sort of in software development, what's called waterfall, where you have the visionary that gives the commands and everybody goes out and does their tasks. Incredibly mechanical, incredibly hierarchical, also incredibly effective, for certain things. It's that question of like solving for, one thing, right? It's okay. If that's the one thing you're solving for, great. It could be extremely effective, but there are consequences to that. So for us, it's really challenged us at the deepest levels of how we're thinking about how do you involve communities in the co-design? How do you approach things relationally? How do we cultivate the capacities for self-management and self-governance within our team? Because the nature of a complex living system is there is no like just central hub, and everybody needs to be able to have an image of the whole system in their minds so that they can be more self-directed. And that's generally not the way that corporations and software development, that's generally just not the way that it works. So we've been engaged in a pretty intense experiment with that. And so the point we're at now is really working on the qualitative aspects of all of this. And that, so many GIS tools are kind of based on the tacit assumption that if you give people the data or the information, that they'll be compelled to act. And of course, they'll see what's there. And so we want to map the biodiversity and we want to map the forests and we want to like see this global picture. And we want to, that all of that is sufficient. And what we're discovering by being on the ground at the microclimate level is that is absolutely insufficient, because there are deeper layers of culture, of capacity, of capability that need to be developed in order to design and sustain these initiatives. Now that sounds abstract. Let me give you a practical example. The person that we're working with, not the person that I'm working with many, but the person that started the organization we're working with also started an organization called Tree People. His name's Andy Lipkiss. And for 50 years, he was working on urban forestry in Los Angeles with Tree People. And what he found was that if you didn't invite people to plant the trees in their community, and even furthermore, if you didn't invite them to plant pieces of their hair with the trees so that they had a physical relational bond with their DNA being mixed in with the trees, that it was hard to get them to care over time. That if you just had a government agency coming in and be like, oh yeah, we'll take care of the trees, and the people didn't have a relationship to the trees died, right? Because agencies come and go, politics come and go, like that there were complex dynamics that were involved relationally with that needed to be infused into the processes of, as he says, we don't just plant trees, we grow them, right? And that is very much like how you would relate to any living thing, right? And so a lot of what we had to step back from, and just assuming that we would make these cool tools and people would be able to use them, which is true to some degree. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I think that all of the functional aspects of what we're doing have proven to be quite necessary and useful for a number of projects. But what we had to really spend time on was developing a framework for thinking about what do we want to see enacted? What do the communities want to see enacted? How do we speak to the various principles and aspects of infrastructure that are the types of infrastructure that can sustain vitality and life over time? And that turned out to be quite a task, because even in that questioning, that there are groups very specifically focused in LA on justice and infrastructure. There are other groups that are very specifically focused on green infrastructure, or on the river itself, or on just watershed health. That there were all of these really remarkable initiatives that were going on that were asking these questions around, like, okay, if we're actually going to have resilience, we have to do this, then we have to do this, and we have to do this. And so a lot of what we ended up coming up with was this notion of living infrastructure, which is kind of a term that has been used colloquially for some time by different groups. And we just developed a framework to describe what we mean by that, so that it was unambiguous. And that was something that, we found to be extremely important, because it's easy to forget the various dynamics and relations when considering something as complex as an infrastructural design project. And so now much of what we're doing is working on how do we embody the principles of this framework, of this paradigm, really, into the experience of the tools themselves, so that these don't just seem like abstract philosophical conversations, but instead they're like enacted and embodied through the process of inquiry of trying to understand a place.
You sent it to me before we chatted. I just pulled it up on my screen, the Living Infrastructure Framework. It's gorgeous. I mean, I can imagine that anyone that's developing any kind of project, because as you said, like everything in a way is infrastructure, like it's the kind of concretization of our worldviews in physical form. And I mean, this could apply for ecological projects as well, but you have things like, honoring place, growing participation, embodying justice, fostering resilience, regenerating life. Those are the 5 principles I've seen. Would you want to sort of touch on any of them briefly? Because each of them is worthy of its entire, an entire conversation. But they're beautiful guidelines of, are we making sure that each of these things is happening in order for this project to be as you said, like an evolving, organic, living kind of learning system, which anything that humans do is, because we are that as humans.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, every single one of these have libraries of writings and theorizing and histories and practices, and so sometimes that's the most difficult thing, is to kind of distill them in a way that honors and respects that work, and to understand the connections between them. So it's kind of holographic, right? So I use them as kind of shortcuts to heuristics, so that anytime I'm too far down one particular path, I'm like, oh, right, like I don't want to forget this, right? And how to engage each one of them is, in and of itself, like a lifetime of work. So we have to be operating at the level of, like, essentially using them as lenses, right? So that we could look at a project and then inquire into, okay, like, is this being addressed? And in doing that, it actually provides extremely useful ways of deepening the integrity of the projects, and looking at the ways in which, one move can often have positive cascading effects, as opposed to what we're so accustomed to. And a lot of the analyses that are going on around, the cascading impacts, is all the negative things that happen when things collapse, right? And there's an kind of an equal and opposite reaction that can happen, that there can be multiple cascading benefits that occur when you do things. And so these are basically the lenses that we look through in order to understand the nature of those potentials.
Honestly, David, just the effort to, like, take a step back and like codify some of these things and then make it available. And now on the website of it, I'll link it in the show notes. But to make something like this available to people, they may seem obvious when we read them, but actually to come to the conclusion of them is not necessarily an obvious process. Like you said, like we're swimming in these rivers, we're not aware of them, and to step back and be like, okay, what are these living principles that we're using in this place, these communities? It's a huge gift, if I can use that language, to other people that will be trying to do their own infrastructure community projects. It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, would not have been able to do it without our whole team and all the work with the communities we're working with, and none, all of this is collective work, right? And we work very closely with Regenesis to develop these. That it's lifetimes of work that are behind this, and what we found in the time that we've had it sort of public and working. We actually just had the first public release of the software 2 months ago, but we kind of were in private beta for about a year with the communities, and we're finding it to be pretty robust. That folks aren't coming to us and be like, "Hey, what about this? You lost this." That from the perspective of the intentionality, that it covers a lot of ground that hopefully can serve to support looking at various initiatives and projects through lenses that can enhance and deepen their vitality and their potential for evolution. And I don't know if you want to go into each one of them. I mean, we could touch on those.
I think
how much time we have.
Exactly. I'm going to link to it. I think considering we have a few, 5 to 10 minutes left, we've got a little bit of time left. Something that it's bringing up for me is also, and I'm curious if I'm projecting this onto your project, but like the role of imagination. And I think that what I've been learning through a lot of these conversations on life worlds is to put ourselves in the perspective of whether it's an ecosystem, a place, a particular organism, another type of human, it's the difference between like the image of the thing and then imagining it, right? And the image is like the data and the visualizations. But then the imagination piece is a bit different. And I think the imagination is where the active participation comes in. It's like the planting the tree with the piece of your DNA, where it's like we are like, there's a much more expansive, creative, generative involvement of the people. And I've just been hearing across like all these conversations we're having, and also with my day-to-day work, the role of like that imagination process versus just, and in the life worlding, if you will, versus just this is the image and these are the sorts of, it's more dead. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And it's interesting because the language that we use is almost inverted from what you just pointed to.
Okay, go
on. And this is just a semantic thing. Like, so I wouldn't get caught on it, but we refer to in this kind of tradition, thinking about imaging as a process whereby you can kind of close your eyes and see the patterns of the living system, right? And not making it up, right? Because I think part of the challenge that we face right now is that we're constantly being bombarded, especially now, by paradigms, worldviews, cosmologies that purport to be these like long-term visions that are sort of infused technocratic accelerationism, where they're altruistically trying to do the most good for the most people, and so they come to these abstractions that justify their utilitarian approaches to doing things that creates all kinds of harm. But that ultimately the justification is like, but that will help us to get off the planet and create trillions of happy little human digital hybrids. And, there's a lot of crazy cosmological stuff that's driving the very real actions that we're seeing right now. And to me, that is imagination. That's actually from the perspective of like imagining something that isn't grounded in the reality of how systems actually work. It's untethered from the recognition of how living systems really work. And the reason that we use frameworks is to help us to see those patterns and to work with those patterns in a very grounded and consistent and coherent way.
And you could totally switch out the word imagination there for worldview, by the way, because I think the whole techno optimism is itself its own, whole bias and worldview. In the just in the small amount of time that we have left, a lot of people that we collectively know and who are probably listening to this, thinking about LA, have had people they care about affected by the fires, right? And you directly have people in your team and people who you've been working with so closely. When we think about resilience, rebuilding, what should be some of the imaging, some of the ways of thinking that should be front and center as we do that kind of work? You can talk about on the flip side, it's like, what should we not do? But like, what would you advocate people to be on the lookout for, to be integrating based on everything we've kind of talked about and from the perspective of what you guys have been doing in the area? Sure.
I mean, specific to LA, there is a lot of history of things that have been done right. Many examples, of creation of distributed water catchment systems that the fire department has depended on in previous fires to be able to tap into, right? So like that's at a very functional level, implementing large scale distributed, stormwater, rainwater harvesting is absolutely essential for the safety of having reservoirs of water when these fires inevitably come, right? So, and there's lots of examples we could go into and stories about that and how that's happened, but they're often like not recognized or known. I mean, the people that we work with there tried to get a lot of this policy passed 10 years ago, got all the way up to the level of the mayor of LA. The whole project called storm capture wasn't implemented, right? And so and at the same time, like the public works in LA County have actually been doing a lot around storage and capture and so I don't mean to be binary about this, but in terms of moving forward, at least with regards to kind of communities and residences, taking very seriously the need for having large scale distributed capture, right? Taking very seriously the nature of the dynamics of watersheds. It's not just about any, one river, because that tends to be a focus there, is like what's going on with the LA River. But understanding the nature of the health of the dynamics of watersheds. There's a whole Council for Watershed Health there that's been looking at a lot of that for some time. Understanding the nature of development decisions and all the pressures that are put on to, go into the, wildland urban interface, but also the capacity to even build structures that are, fire resistant and hardened, is another huge thing to consider. And the passive house and green building worlds are all over this, and they've got all kinds of guidance on how that can be done. There were many examples of houses that didn't burn because they were built in this way, right? And they had their defensible space, or they had, a lot of various techniques, the building materials and things that actually protected them. So it's like these are very, very pragmatic, functional examples that can be leaned into. Already, like within the first couple of days, the governor of California announced like, oh, well, we need to rebuild as quickly as possible, so we're going to bypass all the environmental regulations. Like, okay, if that's the pattern and the habit that you want to perpetuate so that this can happen once again, go ahead. But like, that's actually not what's called for right now. In a lot of ways, like going slow to consider, and this is going to happen anyway because it's so toxified there right now, but taking the time to really consider what the potential is, given the unique opportunities right now, is the most important thing. And we've actually been very careful not to kind of rush in and express opinions and do all these things, because there's so much noise, and everybody's, got opinions on all the things that need to happen right now. But it's going to be a long game, and it's going to be really important for communities that want to stay there, to understand the dynamics in all these complex relationships, so that the rebuilding effort is done in a way that takes into account all of these forces that are, not simply to be ignored as traditional infrastructure has so often done. And I'm including the infrastructure of, the built environment that is, oftentimes emphasizing single family homes that are in the most beautiful places that, put themselves at extraordinary risk. And the collapse of a lot of those, beliefs are evidenced in what's happened there. And so, the question is, can collectively there be enough of a reflection on this to examine, like, how should this be rebuilt? How could this be rebuilt? There are lots of initiatives underway. I mean, I'm on a call tonight with some of the local indigenous communities talking about the role that cultural burning has played traditionally in managing a lot of these things, right? And these are the things that need to be paid attention to right now, not the demands of like anxious developers and insurance companies that are just like, putting the pressure on politically.
If people want to reach out to you, either for what they've heard around LA, or even just what you've just primed in this last piece around, how are people thinking about rebuilding differently? What's the best way of being in touch? Should people just email the studio, or how can people immerse themselves more deeply?
Yeah, I mean, specifically around Living Infrastructure Field Kit, it's anyone can create an account. It's very LA focused right now. Mm-hmm. We've had many requests from people in other places, and and over time we do hope to expand that, but we're trying to make sure that it works in a place first. And feel free to reach out at livinginfrastructure.org and start a conversation, create an account, play around. That we're constantly evolving and working with different groups to think about how it is we can be supporting the particular needs. We're a small studio, so we don't have a whole lot of bandwidth. So just with that caveat, if we don't get back to you right away, please don't take offense. But I think things are pretty urgent on the ground right now, and most of our attention is really focused on meeting the needs of the folks there. That said, we plan to open source the software so that this can be used around the world in the future. And it's absolutely something that we would love to see, emerge, a community emerging around the ongoing, support and development of a lot of these tools, because the patterns of collapse all the way up to the patterns of regeneration are self-similar around the planet. And we would love to find ways of really supporting many different communities as they're going through not only these difficult times, but also realizing like the deeper potential of, co-designed infrastructure.
David, it's always struck me you have such a gift in conveying the most like kind of, I don't like the word big picture, but let's say like a perspective that is vast and large, and then how you really landed in some of these examples. It's been a profoundly rewarding conversation, and I know that people listening will feel the same. I really, really admire what you guys are doing as well. It's such critical work, and yay to open sourcing. So thank you for that. Thank you for adding to the global commons.
I mean, thank you for holding the space with Life Worlds and all of the extraordinary guests that you've had on over time, because a lot of them are deeply influential in a lot of the work we're doing. And, here's to sticking very close to life for the worlds that we're enacting.
Yoo-hoo to that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Alexa.